Hi everyone, I'm Becky Moon. I'm an artist based in St. Louis in Seoul who creates scenarios prompted by philosophical narratives. And
I'm Susanna Siegel. I'm a philosophy professor and I write a lot about perception and especially visual experience.
Today we are here at Harvard University's Department of Philosophy to give a brief talk about A Sea of Perception, which is a collaborative project that between Susanna and I have created 11 paintings, 7 drawings, and 3 sculptures inspired by the philosophy of perception, and we're gonna talk about how we started the project and give a more general view on what pieces are inspired by what philosophy. So this is a piece called Night of Infinite Resignation, and I started to integrate philosophy into my art with Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, who is a Danish existentialist philosopher, and he had this really shocking concept that this knight who is in love with a princess, but he will never be loved back, and that never quality brings him to the realm of eternity. And I was just so moved by this phrase that I created a whole painting out of it, and since then I started to make artworks that draw direct inspiration from philosophy, because philosophy, there's so much in there, and turning them into art lets you grasp the concept in a matter of seconds, because it only takes so little time to see a painting, whereas it takes a long time to read philosophy. And
that's one of the things that I love about your painting, Becky, is the way that you can take a set of words that sticks in your mind in something discursive that for most people is just an acoustic image, the words that you hear, and then you somehow transform them into these images that capture something about the words. And that's what's been so exciting for me about this collaboration, is to see that interface between words and images. And interestingly, you're working at that interface starting from words and going to images, whereas in my work, I'm starting with visual experience and trying to create words about it that capture some structural aspects of it. So it's just such a delight to see the things that, like magic, come onto the surfaces when you start to paint.
That's the thing. I believe that when I turn philosophy into art, I depict the original phenomenon that the philosopher witnessed before they wrote it down, so that I close the circle in a way that goes from art to philosophy. And yeah, this is another piece that I made, but this time, instead of looking at one source, I looked at a multitude of philosophy concerning eternity. And yeah, this is another piece that I drew inspiration from epistemology, and I personified every school of philosophy into these little characters, and I interviewed them. And one of the characters, I believe it was a rat, is a nihilist, and when I asked the rat, do you think the whale bird will live, he just goes, I don't care, doesn't matter.
So this is an interesting example of philosophy manifesting not so much in a static painting, but in a set of sculptures that move in claymation. And if I'm remembering it right, the video doesn't have, it has music, but it doesn't have an auditory component. It's not the characters don't speak, but there are captions that attach the words to the things. So we have another form of juxtaposing words and imagery in the claymation, which I love.
Yeah. And whenever, the way I work is whenever I read something, I always see corresponding imagery emerge. I guess it's a type of synesthesia. And especially when I read philosophy, I got a lot of imagery out, and they're strangely really consistent, because Kant is always metallic, epistemology is always some sort of animal. Do you think that's because of the barn example, or
there are lots of very sort of stock examples in epistemology that are designed to make a certain philosophical point, and sometimes they're fanciful things that wouldn't actually happen, but they're important to make an argument. But I also have a lot of imagery when I'm thinking about philosophy, and I can never think through anything really without some very, very vivid picture of what's happening. So I feel that we're sort of a good match for exploring these interfaces between vision and philosophy, because in my writing there's always lots of detailed scenarios that at least I picture very vividly, and some of them you've painted or made sculptures out of, which we'll get to in a moment, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That really leads well into the reason I love Susanna's two books, The Contents of Visual Experience and The Rationality of Perception, because I could just see so many exciting visual imagery from Susanna's arguments and the vivid examples with the characters that appear in the book.
Let's tell them about something.
Okay. So, before we dig into Sea of Perception, this is briefly about how we started to work together. Around 2021, I got a commission from another philosopher to create a piece about trees, and the two arguments in philosophy concerning trees that just came up to my head was Susanna's tree argument and George Berkeley's if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound?
So this is an interesting intersection of two discussions from philosophy, both about perception in totally different centuries by totally different philosophers of both time and stature. But we're both talking about trees, but we're making different points about them. But if you're oriented around the imagery, you would put these things together as Becky has done. When I first saw this, which you made this before we met, I always thought, gosh, am I wearing a helmet? That was a tree helmet. But let me just explain the tree argument, not a tree argument. So one of the questions that philosophers of perception discuss is, what kinds of things can you see? So what kinds of things can be presented to you in your visual consciousness as opposed to things that you can only infer from it? So one position, which is sometimes called the thin view, says that all you can really see is colors and shapes and motion, and maybe some technical properties like duration, but you can't see things like that this person is Becky, or that this cup is resting on the table being supported by it, or that a certain type of object is a tree, or a pine tree even more specifically. And I argued in the Contents of Visual Experience that actually the thin view is not right. It doesn't do justice to the full richness of visual consciousness. And the central argument, the central argument started in a paper from back in 2005 called Are Kind Properties Represented in Perception? The central argument centered around pine trees, one of which is in this painting here. And the argument was for the conclusion, the argument was roughly that the argument turned on the scenario that if you had somebody who looked at a group of trees that had all sorts of different trees in it before learning which ones were the pine trees, and then looked at that exact same group of trees after learning which ones are the pine trees, that the trees, even though it's the same scenario, would actually look different to this person before and after as a result of their having gained this recognitional capacity for pine trees. And it might sound like that's just sort of plunked down intuition, or that, I just sort of plunk it down, but actually I found a way to argue for it. I think you can argue for it, and so that's why it took a whole paper instead of just one sentence. So that is the tree argument, and I think that and then 10 years later, Alex Byrne and I wrote a joint piece called Rich or Thin, where Alex is defending the thin view and I'm defending the rich view, and we go back and forth. And I know that you read that one too. And do you want to talk about how the thin view and the rich view interact with your idea of artistic consciousness?
Oh yeah. I just found the rich view so helpful, especially as an artist, because I think when you see an artwork, there's so much more beyond lines and colors and shapes. And one of the arguments that I relate to it is one by Goodman, that when there are two identical artworks and you get the knowledge that one is false, your experience of viewing it seriously degrades afterwards, which is because the rich view of falseness exists. And I just thought that was so compelling. And the tree argument, like, it can apply to so many things, that your knowledge can direct your perception, and can influence what you see and what you see different.
Charles Seward, the philosopher, has a really nice example that I've always loved about how when you first move to a new neighborhood or see a new place, you sort of walk around and you're trying to find your way around. And then, a week or 2 weeks or a month later, once you become accustomed to it, the whole place can just look different. Even though it's the same street, it's the same house, it's the same neighborhood. And I always found that extraordinarily.
Then in 2022, the Washington University Review of Philosophy released their second issue called The Philosophy of War and Violence. And I got to do the book cover, which had Susanna's article, Vigilantism and Political Vision, in it. And I tried to depict this image of a philosopher vigilante who is going to the other direction while the mass and the crowd is going to that direction. Because I felt like that's what philosophers and vigilants do.
So yeah, I wrote a paper about vigilantism, which is this phenomenon that sort of hard to define. There are some paradigms of it where people take the law into their own hands, is the phrase that always comes up when people try to characterize it. And one of the things I love about the way Becky painted this cover is that, and this is a theme in some other paintings that we'll see in the exhibit, she has a wonderful way of depicting crowds. So when I look at this image, I immediately get the sense that there's just people who are in proximity to one another, very close proximity, but yet they're each doing their own thing, yet they're each also aware that they are in proximity to other people. So there's this simultaneous sense of singularity, individuality, but also being in a crowd. And then the philosopher moving in the other direction is somehow like in the crowd, but in some psychological way, maybe more distant from it. So I thought that was just a wonderful way of depicting these things.
Thank you. That really leads well into Sea of Perception, because there are lots of crowd paintings in it. And yeah, to just briefly glance over the process before we go to the artworks, they were really inspired by the 2 books from Susanna and also other written works on the philosophy of perception. And they all started with sketches. We had a lot of conversations and what I call studio magic. And then, yeah, we created these elaborate exhibition plans, and yeah, these are the paintings in my studio. And yeah, it's just to talk about crowds, Susanna gave a talk called The Phenomenal Public.
This talk was about this issue that comes up when people are theorizing about democracy sometimes, where democracy is supposed to be ruled by the people, but like who or what are the people? How are you supposed to even get your mind around the idea of the people? And the standard answer to that question is that you somehow imagine them, or you have sort of rituals that remind you, put you in touch with the idea that actually you are part of this big demos that involves most people you'll never meet, you'll never know, but yet about whose lives you are making decisions, and they are making decisions about your life. So in order for that to have any kind of meaning for anybody, any sort of political subjectivity, there has to be some way of grasping the public. And the thing I started to think about was whether, just in principle, it would be possible to perceive the public, or whether you could only imagine it. What would it be like to perceive the public? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean sort of see everybody in it, but even when we see ordinary objects, we never see all the parts of it anyways. So that made me think a lot about what sorts of perceptions of crowds could, in principle, be perceptions of the public, if any. And so that's what this paper is about, that seemed to have prompted this amazing painting. And I have to say that sometimes, most of the time, as philosophers, we think about things for a long time, and my process is certainly thinking for a long time about things and talking about them for a long time, and writing a paper takes forever, and there's umpteen drafts, and it's sort of a very chaotic creative process. But most of the time, the sorts of responses that one gets, both along the way and also when a paper is done, is more words. People will give you more words. They will say, I don't know about this conclusion you're drawing. Or, you argue for the rich content view, but isn't really the thin content you correct, and so you have debate, and that's why philosophy was in conversation. But with Becky, it's different. With Becky, I write a paper, and what I get back is not an objection or a complaint or another thought or an insight, but I get a painting. And to me, that's just so magical. But also a painting that captures something about what's being discussed and helps see it in another way. So there's a kind of permanence to the painting in the way there's a kind of permanence to a book or to an article, but it's a different sort of permanence. And it, I think, provides another way into the philosophy. It's beautiful on its own, it's intrinsically beautiful, and it prompts, all sorts of thoughts if you, didn't have the adjoining philosophy. But if you did have the adjoining philosophy, it would enrich your experience of philosophy as well.
It's always great. Susanna's works are great for me, especially as an artist, because finding a good source of inspiration is like going through a deep cave with like a tiny spotlight, because there's so much. Everything in the world can be an inspiration, and the artist has to draw out what you can get the most out of among all the inspirations out there. And philosophy, especially the work that Susanna does, I think it's really important because, well, perception is everywhere, and the question is like, what do we perceive when we think we perceive a crowd? And I believe it hasn't been like raised before, or
most of the discussions certainly about perceiving the public and as a mass political public is usually, just people saying, of course you can't perceive the public, it's too big. The public is too big for anybody to perceive. One thing I love just about this way that you did the phenomenal public is just the motion in the water. The motion in the water, it gives you a sense of sort of a temporal current, a temporal context that this is just a moment in, because like the water is a sort of keeping time in a way. And then that locates the scenario in a temporal context where you could just picture the water was in a slightly different arrangement before this moment and will be in another arrangement afterward. So I like the kind of dynamism in this. Also, the green face, and this person trying to perceive the public, the stranger, who's just in her own like very contingent, specific circumstance of in the middle of painting, but looking in the other direction, being held up by this friend, but also by that friend, who are not necessarily coordinating with one another. There's just so much, there's so many interconnections at the same time, and that's what a public is. All of these people who have all these different interdependencies, most of which we don't even know about. And that sense, I feel, is also depicted in this. So I just love the density of activity in this painting. It lets us see the sort of they're simultaneous, but they're also individual, again, like the individual and the public all at once. And look at that green face in the middle. This is like, the old blue depressed women of previous centuries is now the melancholy green woman of the 21st century.
Nice evolution, I guess, of
Blue green.
Yeah.
Blue green.
And this was
First draft.
Right.
Another thing we have in common is drafts. I mean, of course, it's just a thing about creative processes that, oh my gosh, so many drafts. So this was the first phenomenal public.
Yeah.
What kind of feedback did you get on this painting?
Somebody said this is like 100 ingredient soup, and I was like, okay, but I had something good, but I got lost. But I think the reason I do so many redos is because I'm trying to get to the original perception that the philosopher witnessed, and that doesn't take like one go. So in order to really get to the essence of the writing, in order to see what really lies behind the lines of words, I need to like have multiple attempts. And maybe that's what's also happening to you when you're trying to transcribe the original phenomenon into words. Also takes lots of reading.
And just you see so much complexity that's there. You don't really realize how much complexity is there till you look at it. And I can't paint it all or draw, but I know that you could it could seem straightforward to just draw what you see, but oh boy, the moment you begin, you realize how much is really there to be drawn.
This is a sculpture piece called Sea of Perception, and here I try to visualize how when you see something, you get the visual properties and it goes into your mind. And I'm really fond of how Susanna Susanna argues that there isn't a block between you and the world. It's more like there is a ceaseless interaction between you and like outer perceptions, that you see something, you take it in, and get it out. So it's like a continuous ebb and flow, and I could like see so much relations with it, with the ocean, and how like fishes come and go, and how the water comes and goes. And Susanna's mother, who makes art, made this really beautiful zebra-looking fish for the cover of Contents of Visual Experiences, and that fish, I've also turned her into a sculpture. It was such a vivid imagery that got me going throughout the process.
Maybe we should talk about the affordance
Oh
painting.
yeah.
We were talking about the relationship between the perceiver and the things in the world that they perceive, and some of the scenarios that are in this painting are also in a paper called Affordances and the Contents of Perception. James Gibson and Eleanor Gibson were psychologists writing in the 60s and 70s, and they formulated this very important concept that I found very compelling and powerful, which is the idea that a chair affords sitting. An affordance is a kind of possibility for action. And the Gibsons thought that all you see are affordances. So they were interested in comparing perceptions of humans and animals, where a pond affords, is like home for turtle, but
Not so much
not so
for
much
us, for
for us.
sloth.
Yeah.
For us, what's
for
yeah.
a monkey. For a monkey. But I was interested in this paper. I was interested in how, like, a forest could afford. So the affordance of a pond for a fish is sort of stable. It kind of goes with the organism. But when it comes to human perception, I was interested in cases, in affordances that might vary with the background state of the person. So I discuss the difference between seeing the forest as a threatening place versus seeing the forest as a place of refuge. And I think that part of that discussion prompted, this woman on the left who's looking at the trees and maybe feeling pulled in by them as a kind of affords a place she wanted to go. And then of course there's chocolate cake, which can afford, come on in, chocolate cake can afford being eaten. So some of these scenarios were depicted in this paper.
Yeah, the forest is giving a little tappy tap on the woman's shoulder, and I tried to actually paint out the affordances and how the pear is also giving a little tappy tap. And yeah, if you could actually see the affordances in these little hazy, oozy strands of gases, that's how it would look like. And yeah,
Seeing stars. Should we talk about seeing stars?
sure.
So in the Contents of Visual Experience, at one point, I'm talking about the difference between seeing stars from being hit on the head and seeing stars in the sky.
I've
And the
seen
difference
some of
between
them.
these two types of visual experiences, where in the one case, when you're seeing stars in the sky, you're seeing them as things that are distinct from you, they're occupying some space that other things can occupy and other people can see. Whereas a very, very odd thing about seeing stars, if you stand up too fast, or you have low blood pressure or something something knocks you on the head, those stars are different. They move with you. They go where you go. But we could describe both of these things with the same form of words, seeing stars. So that's one thing I love about this. This is a philosophy lesson on canvas right here, because there are these two scenarios of seeing stars, which is a perfect title for this.
We can talk about the Francos now.
Okay.
Susanna has this character named Franco who appears throughout her various essays in her book, and here Franco's doing a sky stunt. But
so Franco, this was an example of kind of gratuitous imagery. So sometimes I have imagery of a scenario that helps illustrate a philosophical point. But then sometimes those illustrations kind of take on a life of their own, and that's kind of what happened with Franco. So I got kind of attached to Franco, this character. So let me explain how Franco came to be. So one of the questions that philosophers and psychologists think about is how it's possible to see things as individual objects, and how we even parse the world into objects to begin with. So this is a fascinating topic that lots of developmental psychologists have made a great deal of progress on. But when it comes to just visual consciousness, how do we, tell when one object ends and another one begins? And as I was thinking about this, writing a paper called How does visual phenomenology constrain object seeing? I imagined this, I have to say something. That first, so Fred Dretske, rest in peace, was a wonderful philosopher of perception who had talked about this issue as well. And he had the idea that, if you were just sort of staring at a beige brick on a wall, you could just see the brick, or even just a patch of the wall. You could see it because, if that very patch were to change color, counterfactually, it would stick out to you, and after all, it's like right in front of you, so you can see it. So this was a case where philosophers are using an illustration of beige wall. But I was thinking that, so phenomenology for Dretske had really nothing to do with it. It was just this counterfactual condition of the reason I counted seeing this particular patch on the beige wall is because like it's right in front of me, it's causing me to have a certain experience. And if something else happened in that spot, I would see it as well. My version of trying to think through these scenarios involved a person named Franco who did a sky stunt. He made himself the same color as the sky, and he went up, and so he was glue. He was like, he had this great sky suit, and he went up in the sky, and you couldn't see him, so you looked at the sky, and then I was thinking, well, do you see Franco? And my argument was no, but I won't bore you with that argument. But the point was that there was a guy in the sky, and he was glue, and he was named Franco, and this had some impact on Becky because there's Franco. And see, if Franco had been red, then you would see him more readily. I won't try to reconstruct exactly this argument before, but the point is that here we have some scenario that's operating in philosophy that can have a face. And so, in my mind, so for philosophical purposes, it didn't matter if it was Franco or a beige wall, but I liked it better with Franco. And I guess you did too.
Yeah. I'd rather paint a man in the sky than a beige wall. I'm pretty sure someone has already painted a beige wall in abstract expressionism eras, but I think anyone has painted someone in the sky.
And he's really cute. Franco's really cute.
Yeah.
And look how expressive he is with just a little bit. I mean, that's another kind of thing with the magic of this is that there's so little. So then Franco evolved. Franco evolved into an example of just somebody you were seeing in the context of visual experience, and he was water skiing.
Yeah.
And again, it could have been any sort of, to make the philosophical point, it didn't matter that he was water skiing. But it was just a scenario that needed to have. But it was sometimes these kind of accidental features of scenarios can be as vivid to you as they were to me.
You have this phrase, sometimes Franco's curled up in a chair falling asleep. Sometimes Franco's steering the boat while you're water skiing. But there's this thing about seeing Franco that's like stays constant.
Right.
Amid the different experiences that you take. And there are just so many things out there, and I was just so glad that somebody finally pointed out that is true and that experience does exist.
If you think of people who make comic books, where they're painting or they're drawing like the same character over and over again, and they're doing all these different things. So just as like in a novel that's like tracing the path of a character, we need to be able to, it has to be plausible that we're re-identifying areas and visually the same thing.
We can talk about wits now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So wit is a character in the rationality of perception, and the point of this book, The Rationality of Perception, is to explore two different interfaces. The interface between, within a mind, between what you know or want, or fear or hope on the one hand, and your visual experiences on the other, and then the interface between all of that and your social milieu that might influence the things you believe, the things you see, the things you pay attention to. So wit is a character who comes up in discussing the second interface between what I call the mind of the world, which is a kind of social or cultural milieu that somebody's in, and their mind. And so what I love about this painting is that you painted the mind of the world in his head. So once again, we see this, theme that I find in so many of your paintings, and that I love the way you capture both the singularity of the people, but also the sense that they are in a crowd, making kind of cultural formation, and then having an impact on this one individual. So that's great.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess we can talk about wandering inquiry now. And yeah, it's inspired by Susanna's recent paper about whether can there be inquiry in the process of mind wandering. And I do a lot of mind wandering. I just like just looking at random patterns on the floor. But here there's a phrase in the paper that says there can be both telic and atelic aspects.
Yeah. So what do these words even mean? So a telic activity is one that has a natural endpoint, like running a mile. Like once you run 1 mile, like we're done. You're done running. I mean, you might keep running, but you're done running 1 mile because the mile marker has been passed. Whereas atelic activities have no built-in natural endpoint. And when we think about inquiring into a question, say, there is a sort of open question about whether that is a telic activity because it has a natural ending point, like for example, when you discover the answer, that the question you're inquiring into, or whether it is some way atelic, it has no natural endpoint because it might, for example, unfold more inquiries or something like that. And so that's just a question about inquiry. But when it comes to mind wandering, I found that there was sort of this puzzle of a certain kind, in that mind wandering, your mind just going from one thing to another thing to another thing, and it's really very pleasant, at least for me. So mind wandering seems sort of paradigmatically atelic. It has no natural endpoint because you're not really doing anything in the first place. But inquiry, a lot of people think, or I can see why people might think, that actually inquiring at least into a question, trying to find an answer to a question, sort of naturally comes to an end when you do answer the question.
Yeah.
And if you put those two ideas together about inquiry and mind wandering, it seems like, well, you can't really inquire while your mind is wandering, because your mind wandering is atelic, has a natural endpoint, but inquiry is telic, or so it can seem. But yet, anybody whose mind wanders, which is everybody, you can make progress on things you're wondering about or worried about all the time in mind wandering. This happens all the time. So, famously, like you're taking a shower and you're like, that's the answer. You have an insight or something like that. Or, you're struck with a disturbing thought that, maybe the thing you thought you could bring to Thanksgiving dinner actually you can't. This could just sort of come to you in a spontaneous way. So it seems clear that there is inquiry in mind wandering, but there's at least superficial puzzle about it. So that's what I was exploring in this paper. And one of the solutions that I think there's a lot of solutions to this puzzle, but one of them would be that a single line of inquiry could belong to 2 different kinds of activity at once, one of which is telic and one is atelic, and then we got a picture of this. So do you want to say which is which?
Yeah, so just like how Susanna makes characters, I made these 2 lovely ladies whose names are Atelic Alice and Telic Talia. So Telic Talia is holding, so one strand is going towards the map on a clipboard that Telic Talia is holding, and it has a clear endpoint, which is the end of snail. While on the other hand, the strand just goes on and on and on and on and on, and it's all tangled up, and it's held by Atelic Alice.
There you go.
And yeah, this is about how we are perceiving all the time and how magical perception is.
I love it.
Into one phrase, and we also have on the painting inspired by other philosophers, like the missing shade of blue, the famous example from David Hume, that if you've seen every shade of blue except for one, would you be able to imagine it? And yeah. And yeah, this is inspired by Ned Block's theory on unconscious perception, that similar to how there's only one real Anna Karenina, but there's so many pseudo Anna Kareninas. There's only one conscious perception, but there's so many unconscious perceptions, and I got the list of 24 unconscious perceptions, and then I visualized each of them into different shapes of fish, while there's one real conscious anacarina fish. These are the 24 unconscious fish.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
They're
And
beautiful.
thanks. And yeah, and this is about Iris Murdoch watching grass. And she talks a lot about attention and how a just and loving attention can really shape the way you perceive. And I just think that's so beautiful. And this is her looking at a fly with just and loving attention. And yeah, this is also about the rich argument of perception and how you can perceive causality. And yeah, this is about vision, just how when you see something, the properties come inside. And yeah, I guess that was it. To finish off, I just wanted to mention that this has been an especially meaningful project to me because to create art that's inspired by philosophy also means that I get to condense the work of a philosopher that she has been working on for so many years into one singular painting. And I just think that has a lot of power into it because you can just see it at one go.
Yeah, that's very meaningful for me as well because you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when you're having a dream and then you wake up from your dream and you try to think of what happened in the dream and you realize how much was happening and it almost takes you longer to remember the dream than it took you to dream the dream.
Yeah.
Like the dream was just a moment, but the memory is much longer. And this reminds me of that in that, you know, there's so much I can have in one, you know, you can in a certain sense take in it all at once, at least you just see it. Of course you have to stand in front of it for an hour or something to, you know, for a long time to like recover all the different parts of it. So I really appreciate it.
Also, it has been great working with a living philosopher because when I was making paintings on Kierkegaard, I couldn't like text Kierkegaard and say, hey man, is the night of infinite resolution wearing a helmet? Like, he's not gonna reply, like he doesn't even have a phone. So it was just all the conversations that we had about philosophy and about dogs and about colors and about everything. It has just been so wonderful and I'm so glad that we are finally showing these at Everson Hall, 2nd floor. And we're gonna have an opening on Tuesday, October 10th at 5 p.m. 2023.
For all the people listening in the future.
With music by the talented Stella G. Gaitaman Willoughby, who is a composer, and she has composed this awesome piece called The Air Around Us, and which is also about perception. So
Amazing.
please be there.
Multimodal philosophy.
Yeah, perception. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, here's to more art and philosophy.
Woo! Thanks for listening.